Hi, everybody. Thank you for attending our panel this evening. I know that there's another panel that's going on, so you could have been attending that one. And just in general, it's been a long week, a long day, and folks have a lot of Zoom fatigue. So I really appreciate you coming and joining us this evening. My name is Danielle. I am the administrative chair of the National Abolition Working Group, as well as the co-chair of River Valley DSA in Western Massachusetts. We're really excited for this panel this evening. It's kind of an introduction to the members of the National Abolition Working Group and to kind of our political vision and orientation in DSA. And so the panel is titled Abolitionist Strategy in DSA, From Defund to Liberation. Some of the key questions for the discussion that follow include: what does it mean to engage in abolitionist organizing as socialists? What is the current state of abolitionist organizing at the chapter level? And what could our organizing and politics become as we continue with and move beyond our current orientation? And so even amongst our working group, there really isn't a clear consensus about the role of DSA in the abolitionist struggle for liberation. And we hope to use this panel as a kind of introduction to kind of mapping out what some of those contours can be. And to begin with, it is important to orient ourselves in terms of the trajectory of abolitionist organizing in DSA. Obviously, this is kind of a new front for us, and we're hoping to kind of just set the framework through the experiences of one of our abolition working group members, Rosa Palmieri. Rosa is a member of New York City DSA and has worked on various abolitionist campaigns in the city, including No New Jails New York City, Free Them All for Public Health, and DSA's Defund NYPD campaign. She has also run jail and bail support for mass actions, a mutual aid table outside of Rikers bus stops, and helped to support incarcerated people at Rikers Island. And Rosa is one of the authors of Resolution Number 3, Empowering DSA's Mass Abolition Work, which passed as part of the consent agenda. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Rosa.
Thanks so much, Danielle. And I want to just start off by saying that it has been such a gift and an honor to work with my comrades in the National Abolition Working Group thus far. It's a huge relief to work with people who know that in especially the US, socialism and abolition are inextricably linked, that abolition is a mode of organizing rather than simply a kind of project or campaign. It's a lens to clearly see and build strategy, and it's a daily practice that will transform how we relate collectively and individually. So I want to thank all my comrades on the working group, and I'm really looking forward to all the work we do together in the coming year. So it's been quite a long road to get to this point in DSA, where there are principled abolitionists gathering to put forward strategy and working to change DSA's internal structures. I've been a member of DSA since the tail end of 2017, and I joined looking for solidarity and guidance after a loved one was incarcerated. He was very young, just barely over the age limit to be tried as an adult, experiencing lots of mental trauma after being displaced by a hurricane, and he was facing very, very serious charges. We had to quickly figure out J-pay, commissary visits, tracking through sudden transfers, new cellmates, plea bargaining, finishing high school through the Department of Corrections, how to support someone emotionally day to day, et cetera, et cetera. Things new to me at that time, but that most Americans have to deal with at some point in their lives. My parents are leftists, so I've always been a socialist, and I knew that in order to get him out, I would need comrades who would both help me navigate the system and who would understand fundamentally that no matter what, jail and prison were not an answer, and that we had to get him out and that we couldn't give in. I needed a mass movement who would work to stop this from happening to anyone. So I joined DSA. On meeting with my mobilizer, I found that there actually wasn't much work happening in the chapter formally around decarceration. But I stuck around and did find the solidarity I was looking for. And over time, I also found that on the fringes of the chapter, there were small decarceral projects happening. A developing system for jail support at Actions, phone zaps for incarcerated people in dire conditions, a table at bus stops to Rikers Island, a political education session around transformative justice in the Socialist Feminist Working Group, blockades at ICE raids. The various These various pieces and the comrades I met in these spaces helped me grow as an organizer and abolitionist. And after a year-long fight, we secured his release. Since then, this work has also led me to projects outside of DSA, like No New Jails, New York City, which fought a series of new jails in the city and is an ongoing fight. I've been made much more aware of an ecosystem of abolitionist groups who have been at this work for a very, very long time, many of them formerly and currently incarcerated organizers. And as these groups come in and out of coalition with DSA, I've realized how powerful we are together and how DSA has so much to offer the abolitionist movement. DSA is big, it's transformative, it's democratic, and in all of its organizing, from tenant unions to shop floor organizing to reproductive justice, it's doing the hard work of excarceration, giving people dignity and fulfilling basic human needs, and that's what keeps people out of prison. Then the pandemic started, and while DSA was definitely on the ground doing incredible work across the country, in some ways we did not meet the moment. In New York City, COVID was ripping through Rikers Island. The jails had the highest rate of infection in the entire city. It was the epicenter of the pandemic that March. And the NYPD, often unmasked, was continuing to throw people in jail. Unfortunately, New York City DSA had not made the inroads necessary to effectively push for release. Then the uprising reminded us how volatile and mobilizing these issues are for the working class. But we could do little to sustain that moment because we hadn't been focused on policing before, despite massive chunks of city budgets being spent on something that is very obviously harmful to working class communities, a violent force that makes it difficult for us to organize as criminalization increasingly threatens many parts of our lives. I think it's important to reflect on how much we've grown as well as these missteps so that we can commit ourselves wholeheartedly to abolition going forward. Abolitionist organizing needs to take up space in DSA. We need to devote resources to it. We need to support members who have incarcerated family and friends and members who are currently or formerly incarcerated themselves. And we need to think about how it affects all of our organizing because abolitionist demands are mass demands that are not just about dismantling a broken system. They are about unlocking the power of a mass working class movement in the United States. Thanks everyone for being here, and I'm going to pass it back to Danielle.
Thank you, Rosa, for sharing your experience and for offering examples of what DSA can bring to abolitionist organizing. Within the working group, we have been grappling with this question, right, of what our intervention as socialists is in a movement that includes national, regional, and local orgs, community groups and networks, as well as theorists on both sides of the wall, many of whom have a radical politics, are BIPOC-led, have been organizing against the PIC for years and decades, and are deeply connected to communities targeted by carceral institutions. For a long time, abolition has not been a priority within DSA, despite the connections that socialists, including Eugene Debs, have made between the PIC and class struggle. As abolitionists, we are organizing against the immiseration of human life under and because of capitalism. And as my friend Stevie Wilson reminded me this morning, he's an incarcerated organizer, we are engaged in the struggle not only for emancipation, but liberation from oppression and repression. And as such, our politics align with the fight for a socialist future. And as Rosa shared, many of us came into DSA with an abolitionist politics and analysis. And I think have had some kind of surprising experiences in the sense that we've come up against a kind of lack of understanding of what abolition is or isn't, and sometimes outright resistance to it in some of our org spaces. And so I want to invite working group member Bettina Johnson to help think through what abolitionists bring to democratic socialism and why socialists should engage in abolitionist organizing. And Bettina Johnson is a member of Chicago DSA and has been very involved in the Defund work in that chapter. And so Bettina, I'm going to toss it to you.
Thank you, Danielle. So my name is Bettina. My pronouns are she, her, or they, them. And I am a fairly new member to DSA in general. And it's because DSA has taken strides towards actually committing to abolition through embracing bold demands, including defund CPD and Chicago DSA. So that's one of the main reasons why I'm in the Democratic Socialists of America. But another main reason why I was attracted to DSA and the Afro-Socialists and Socialists of Color Caucus of DSA is because of my experience going through anti-racist organizing, student organizing that's focused on anti-racism and anti-state violence organizing. And just that it wasn't very obvious that we needed to talk about class and that we needed to talk about socialism. And so I came into DSA wanting to learn a lot more. And through this last year of a lot of struggle and coming together, wanting to learn more, but also wanting to bring the gifts that I have been given by movement, by my movement family and by my people to DSA, then I truly have started this this understanding of how socialism and abolition fit together, because it was intuitive to me, but now through this work, the potential is obvious and the analysis needs to be sharpened to actually craft and weave together how abolition and socialism fit together. And I'm sorry, I was having technical difficulties coming on tonight, so I'm like going off the dome right now. But yeah, so basically I just wanted to share my story of how I came here. So basically when the second Bernie Sanders campaign happened, there was the 100 Black Women for Elizabeth Warren. And I was just honestly horrified that folks that I looked up to in the abolitionist movement were talking about how they were backing someone who would identify as capitalist to the bone. So that was just a real clear awakening for me, that the things that I had assumed were not to be assumed. Like I needed to ask the actual clear-cutting questions to get at, actually discerning who our comrades are and who is actually down for a revolution against capital, but also for socialism and even towards towards a communist horizon. And so that's where I'm coming from. That's where I think our gifts as folks that have been working on abolition for years, interfacing with a democratic socialist organization and truly grappling with how do we do this in a popular education way, but also grounding down in a complicated and sophisticated point of view when it comes to all of the things that we need to do to actually walk the path towards the horizon of socialism and abolition together. And one of the other last things that I really needed to say tonight is defund CPD for me, and then for as how we've been running it in Chicago, is to lessen contact with the police, not just to refund or shift around funding priorities. Because the belief is, and it's true, that the police act as the hands that grab folks and pull them into the mouth of the carceral state and into jails and prisons and into the courts, and separates children from their families. So when we say defund the police, it's not just about refunding the things that we need to make us safe, but also to stop violence at the hands of the police. So thank you so much. I really believe that we're off to there's a lot of possibilities. It's very exciting. But I also really want to lean into the challenges that are totally going to be up ahead, and to have these conversations in the public square in DSA and have this be something that we all talk about and grapple with together. Thank you.
Thank you, Bettina, for kind of getting us started as well in terms of opening up that conversation, because as I said before, I think there's been a lot of discussion within the members of the working group about abolitionist practice, how that intersects with socialism, right? Obviously, we're all socialists, but it is to say that our work is obviously deeply anti-capitalist, and there's lots of kind of points of alignment. But I think how chapters have been engaging in that work has been very different, right? What are the kind of understandings of abolition have been very different. What is or isn't abolition, I think has been contested. And so we're hoping to kind of hear from some of the folks who have been engaged in this work at the chapter level to kind of get at some of this stuff. And just to clarify before I apologize, PIC is the Prison Industrial Complex, and I apologize for just using that acronym and not stating it out. So some people think about the PIC as the carceral state. There's different terminologies. But again, chapters throughout DSA have been engaged in abolitionist organizing, mostly through defund campaigns. And I want to thank all the folks who filled out our Abolition Working Group survey. We got a lot of awesome information from you guys, and we're looking forward to integrating that into our work going forward. It was clear from the respondents that the majority of chapters who are engaged in abolitionist work were focused on defund. If they were still operating, I think as to be expected, a lot of chapters started this work after the George Floyd uprisings, and then defund campaigns are really difficult, and they can be hard to kind of sustain, especially given the kind of power of municipalities, police unions, and so on. So, but we kind of found that a lot of chapters are looking for information about how folks were waging these campaigns, say in New York City and Chicago, where there's really vibrant defund movements. And so we're going to hear from folks about that. And we wanted to invite working group members both to share their experiences organizing at the chapter level, and what these experiences suggest about the current orientation of abolitionist organizing within DSA, as well as what we should prioritize going forward now that there's a clear mandate for this work within DSA. And so I'm going to invite Cheryl Rivera, who is a member of New York City DSA and a founding member of Abolition Action, which is an abolitionist collective that grew out of a socialist feminist reading group. She's currently working on the Defund NYPD campaign and mutual aid efforts. We will also hear from Dawn Harrington. She is the executive director of Free Hearts and the director of special projects for the National Council for Incarcerated Women and Girls. During her incarceration, Dawn was disturbed by the impact of incarceration on families, especially women and kids, and inspired to make a difference upon her release. Dawn does abolitionist work on local, state, and national and international levels, focusing on women and girls. She's a member of DSA and has been involved in coalition spaces that include her local DSA chapter. And we will also be joined again by Rosa Palmieri from New York City DSA. And so Cheryl, I'm going to start with you because you've done a lot of political education around defund for Why DSA, for defund nationally, as well as a lot of work in your chapter. And I'm just curious if you can share some of your experiences with our audience, and again, focusing on what do those experiences kind of suggest about our current orientation, as well as what our priorities should be going forward.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really important for us to orient ourselves around political education that shows an abolitionist perspective, that says, why as socialists do we need to abolish the police? It seems that some people, I've encountered people who do not see that the police are one of our main barriers as socialists to achieving the world we want to achieve. They think of it as potentially like a nice to have versus like a absolute necessity, which it is. When you see the police as really the enforcers of this current structural order that we have and the enforcers of capital, they are, yes, racist inherently. They are violent inherently. And this is because capitalism is inherently both racist and violent. But, I see that occasionally people think that these are just like side things, like the racism, the violence, and that you can just like reform them. I'm not a person who's able to keep a lot of names in my head. I like, when you read stuff, it kind of goes out of my head. But I've heard it said many times that the history of policing, the history of prisons is the history of reform. And that's true, that what we have currently is the result of many different ideas of reformation. So the violence that you're seeing in the prison industrial complex right now, this like incredibly violent system, surprisingly enough, is the result of a lot of reforms that people have said time and time again are going to make it less violent, are going to make it more humane, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, despite all of that sort of reform, we still have a system that is particularly violent, particularly racist, and that at every turn upholds capital. And because of this is why I think this is the reason political education is super important, because when you start to understand what is the true history of policing globally, and policing is not very old, it's fairly young. And when you understand the history of prisons, like globally, and also particularly within the US, you then start to see that this is very much bound up in capital, very much bound up in, racial capitalism. Capital is about race as well, from the very beginning. So there is not going to be a way for us to have a nice police force, a good police force, a better police force, a better prison system. That's just not possible. But you only start to see this if you really do the political education that gets into that history, that gets into what is really the purpose of policing, what is the purpose of prison. And so I think that's why it's very important that we engage in that, because at this moment growing up, that's not the idea of prisons and policing that we have. We have this implicit understanding baked into the way that our society is structured, what the messages we're told, that crime must be, first of all, that crime is real. What is crime? First of all, I think we have to interrogate that, what is structured as crime. Criminality is something to deconstruct. But also that the only way to approach the problems of our society are with this repressive and violent system, the prison industrial complex, which it just is not true. And as we can see right now, we have more policing, more prisons than ever. And yet we have not eradicated homelessness. We have not eradicated gender-based violence. We have not, any of these things, this gun violence, people right now in New York City, we are seeing the response to the Defund NYPD campaigns, the response from people like Eric Adams, who is unfortunately going to be our mayor. The response is that crime is on the rise because of this defund campaign that's happening. The NYPD has not been defunded. They have not been defunded at all. If crime is on the rise, which arguably it is not, but if there is still crime, this is under the conditions of capital, under the conditions of the current incredibly large police and prison industrial complex. This does not solve the problem. Yet we're being told that just increase the prison industrial complex and that's going to solve the problem. So what can we do to combat that narrative? The number one, the first thing I think to do is do a lot of political education around this, because this is not the education, this is not the understanding that we're getting of the prison industrial complex right now. Just growing up, that's not the understanding that I got of what was happening. And so political education helps us make sense of this world around us. Why are we living the way we're living? Why are people still on the streets? Why are people hungry, homeless? Why is there crime? Why are there increasing numbers of people in prisons if every year we're giving more and more money to prisons and policing? Why has this not resolved the problem? Who is going to prison? Who is being affected by this violence? Why are those people targeted in particular? What is the purpose of all of this violence that we're experiencing that is directed to a particular race, to a particular type of people, to particular classes of people? What does this all mean? The political education helps that make sense for people and helps us as socialists understand why this is so important. The police are the stick, in capital. They are the stick. And you saw this last year in the protests. You had all these people go out into the street. You had an incredible amount of anger about police violence, but also we're in a moment of crisis with the pandemic. People are out of work. People are dying, of disease. We're not getting a response from our government, and people are angry, and people are getting evicted from their houses. Who shows up? There are the cops. There they are. That is what political education helps us understand. What is that role there? When the cops show up to evict you from your apartment because you didn't pay rent, but they do not show up when your landlord does an illegal eviction. The political education understands, why is that? Why is that? What is the history that has led us to this moment? And then what do we need to do to meet that moment? And so I think that's why it's really crucial that we do a lot of political education, which we do a lot of in the Defund NYPD campaign and NYC DSA. We've undertaken a lot of political education, but I think it is a really long-term thing to invest in so that we're ready as socialists to understand, why is it important to be abolitionist? You cannot achieve socialism if you're not an abolitionist, because every time you will try to fight your landlord, every time you will try to fight as a union. We saw that here with the workers in Hunts Point. What happened? The police came out like they had a union protest. Here are the police. So as socialists, we need to understand that the police are our enemies, and they're going to arrive at every moment to beat us. So to be socialists, we must be abolitionists. And that's what political education has, helped me, enabled me to see. And I think that's why it's very important as part of our abolitionist work across our DSA chapters.
Thank you, Cheryl, for that. I think the role of political education is so critical, as you said, because so much of our conditioning, particularly in the United States, has been a really specific orientation to police, to prisons, right? Like, folks who are incarcerated deserve it, right? The police are there to protect us. When the reality is, and this was a question from someone in the audience, right? Like, there's no clear link between policing and safety, right? And we know this because majority of time when police show up, if they do show up, right, is generally after the fact. So they're not preventing kind of any form of violence, nor are they doing anything to support a community to kind of deal with conflict, right? They do nothing to prevent violence before the fact. So at most they respond after. And as Cheryl pointed out, a lot of times they produce violence themselves, right? And so there isn't this clear link. And so much work has to be done just getting folks to understand that piece, right? Because I think, so much of all the television that we see, so much of everything that we see says the very opposite. Like, police are there to keep you safe. Without the police, there's going to be chaos. And the reality is, so many of our communities don't actually really have contact with the police, right? Like, if you think about white middle class neighborhoods, there is no sustained contact with police. Most of their time is spent without police. And it's certain communities that have to engage with police on a regular basis, right? And often very negative ways. So we have to really challenge this idea of safety and police presence and the role of police in our society. And so, Rosa, I'm really curious to kind of hear your thoughts. I know Cheryl's really engaged in political education and in the Defund campaign there. And you're both involved in Defund as well as decarceration and jail support. And so I'd be curious to hear kind of your experiences of abolitionist organizing kind of beyond Defund. And I don't mean to say that as a kind of critique of Defund in any way, but I just mean doing abolitionist work outside that context. What have you kind of learned? What would you want to share with the audience? And how does this shape maybe you're thinking about DSA's priorities going forward?
Yeah, I think I'm really interested in being creative and looking for new avenues. So especially for base building projects. So one of the things that I found sort of interesting that happened right after. So during the uprisings, myself and many other comrades were involved in a massive jail support initiative. I don't know. We were just responding, and we were outside. We were outside of 2 courthouses and 1 precinct, 24 hours a day for 2 weeks. And I was helping to coordinate offsite. And it was, I mean, extremely chaotic. There were FBI agents wandering around. People were being moved to other places and then released. They had like a place for minors. It was very scary. And it was all during COVID, and it was extremely like dangerous inside the precincts. People were being held for 3 days at a time. So it was like a very, very intense time, but we did manage to really build some systems out of that. And like, we did manage to sustain it for that time, and work in conjunction with a bail fund that was also mobilized really quickly. So I'm very interested in creating systems like that are like, can sort of be ready in waiting, and work in conjunction with places like the National Lawyers Guild that have their own systems ready to go. So how do we work in the ecosystem that already exists? And another thing that I'm interested in is like thinking about what we can do once people are arrested, like in mass actions. So how do we take, like, for instance, in the uprisings, there were so many arrests, and so many people facing charges together, and people can, coordinate mass defense. And when we coordinate mass defense, we can also make demands of the court and refuse plea bargains, and demand that, we won't take plea bargains until other people who are incarcerated are released. So I'm interested in like that, the solidarity between protesters, and like people who are maybe not regularly criminalized, but in a mass movement are, and people who are already incarcerated. The other thing that happened that I guess I'll share, and I don't really know what it means yet, but I thought it was an interesting thing. Like it was a small win, but it was also a big win in this moment. But during the peak, like the height of COVID, I was doing a lot of work to get people out of jail, and we were, pressuring everyone we could think of, the district attorneys, the judges, the mayor. It was a very, like, anything we could do. And the place we were in the end able to have the most effect was the Board of Corrections, which is like a kind of an oversight board for the Department of Corrections. And, it's really usually extremely unhelpful, and I wouldn't recommend it normally, but, in that moment, it was a place that, like, so many public defenders and organizers showed up in that space together, advocating for people inside to get them out, and also to stop rolling back basic health protocols that, like, people were unable to even talk to like a social worker during that time. So we managed to stop these rollbacks from happening. We did manage to get people released. It was a very difficult thing, but I think we just have to keep looking for those places those weak links in the chain, and thinking really creatively about how we do this. So yeah, that's what I'll share for now.
Thank you, Rosa, for sharing that. And I think one of the things that is kind of important distinction, or point that I should say, Cheryl and Rosa, you both raised, is this idea of reforming institutions, right? Like, what should our relationship be to DAs, police, and all this stuff, right? Like, can we actually achieve abolition through reforming the institutions or policies, right? And Don, I kind of want to turn it to you, both, opening it up the same kinds of questions that I was asking Cheryl and Rosa, but also, you do so much incredible organizing, both in relationship with DSA and outside DSA. And I think have really learned a lot of lessons I think would be really critical for us to hear, particularly about how do we talk to folks who don't share our politics, right? So how are we engaging with folks across different political spectrums, races, classes, in the struggle for abolition? As well as just like some of these questions that we're seeing from audience members that I know you could speak really well to. Again, this question of reform versus abolition, and how do we actually organize for abolition in concrete ways? And so Don, I'm going to turn that over to you.
Okay, thank you. So basically, the uprisings of last summer and the national push to defund has overall moved the needle in abolition, and a lot of chapters have engaged in this work, and I think that it really has moved the needle forward, but we still have a lot of work to do. Abolition is not only defund cops, but it's abolishing cops, courts, cages, and more so abolishing the condition that we use, that we're using this violent, racist, classist system, instead of getting to the root causes of what people need. When I was locked up, I noticed that, I was incarcerated with so many brilliant women, poor and working class women, that had so many beautiful gifts and so much that we could give to the community, or different ideas for what was actually needed, what we actually, needed as far as childcare, to heal from the trauma, economic development, whatever the case may be, some kind of safety and security. But instead being failed by these systems, and what we're receiving is this violent system that doesn't fix any of the issues, not for us, not for even if there's someone that has been harmed. It doesn't fix anything, but it exacerbates all of the problem. And when it boils down to it, we don't have options or solutions outside of this. For example, we had a sexual assault happen within our community, and we go to the center that's available here and are like, can you not call the police? We want to deal with this. And they still had the police to call one of our young people in our community. And it's like, if you call mobile crisis for a mental health crisis for a loved one or a family member, and say, is there any way that you can send anyone other than the police? Then they'll say, well, no, because we have to send them out. This is where I am in Tennessee, but we see this everywhere. When what you have to go through to get assistance with childcare, for example, it's so many loops and hoops, on top of people are struggling to make ends meet, having increased barriers to housing. We're in a eviction crisis, and we were already being discriminated against legally. And so it's all of these collateral consequences that we're dealing with, all of these conditions that are leading us in to this system that's working exactly how it's supposed to be. And so I think, what's important to note is that abolition is not just about what we tear down, but more importantly, it's about what we build up and how we build it up. You see what I'm saying? We can't, and I think this is something very important for DSA as far as an intervention that can be made together, because we can't replace it with the capitalist system that exists right now. This system does not work for us. It's creating the conditions that put us in the first place. And so what we need to do in order to even think about being able to abolish this system, we have to collectively and cooperatively build something that centers poor and working class people that have been impacted. And, it doesn't act as if, things won't happen. But it's something that we insert in all of what we do, including how we're dealing with each other, including how we're dealing with each other. We have to insert abolition, which means also what you build, building something together cooperatively and collectively. And it's not about acting as if things won't happen, but it's coming up with a collective agreement and infrastructure with a strong class analysis to address sexual and domestic violence, mental health crises, access to child care, access to medical care, development, housing, education outside of the system. It's creating something together that is outside of the system that we all can take ownership in, that we all can take governance in, creating something else to replace this. And so I just want to say, it can look like a lot of different things. Participatory defense, and, challenge the power in the court system, with people power to save time instead of serve time, and shout out to Silicon Valley Debug. With that model, we do this work in Nashville, and there's hubs all across the country, but the whole thing is we're trying to save time instead of serve time. And our local participatory defense, we built a bail fund land trust because we realized, a lot of our bails were way too high for our families in our participatory defense that are coming every week. And so, but for people that were able to wrestle out of the system, they're coming out to nothing. They're coming out to zero infrastructure. And so that's why it's so important, not only what we break down, but what we build up. Cooperatives, decriminalizing poverty. A lot of what we see in incarceration is the criminalization of poverty. But we also have to abolish poverty. We have to be able to abolish the actual conditions that lead to us having this institution of incarceration. We need to build up new systems that are so-called addressed by this harmful, violent, racist, classist, carceral system that exists. And part of that is building relationships with each other. And I'll just say, Middle Tennessee DSA works in coalition around defunding cops, courts, and cages, and investing in our community. Also, in Rotting to the Core Coalition, the No Exceptions Prison Collective, Rotting to the Core Coalition, that we also work really closely with, and ended the Core Civic contract, which Core Civic started in Nashville, where I'm from. But this is what I mean by abolition. Not only just cut the contract with Core Civic and have this, you have this switch over to the sheriff's office, but let's actually, now we're on, close the jail and repurpose it to what the community needs. We do people's movement assemblies and, figure out as a community what are the issues, and collectively building the infrastructure is just as important when it comes to abolition. So yeah.
Thank you, Don. And I'd be curious, if you don't mind, just touching on as well, how you've been able to, in Tennessee, again, build campaigns, I think, with folks across political spectrums, right? I think this piece is really key because we're not going to be, joining spaces where folks are on board for socialism, right? And so how do we kind of build power with folks who maybe disagree with our politics or who aren't in alignment with us in a lot of other ways, right? As DSA, how can we still make sure that we're building effective campaigns and coalitions? Do you mind talking about that a little bit, Dawn, in terms of your ending criminalization campaign?
Yeah, definitely. The thing is, that's why we must focus on our conditions, right? Because one thing that we started realizing, we passed a law here as the second state in the National Council, which actually just passed in Missouri too. It had already passed in Massachusetts, and Tennessee was second. And it was community-based alternatives to incarceration for primary caretakers. And, with that, we started seeing, also around that same time, we were working with Civil Rights Corps on a lawsuit of a privatized probation company that criminalized poor people in Rutherford County. So at that time, in our work in Tennessee with Free Hearts, we basically, at that time, we had a base in a couple of counties because we had done those 2 campaigns. But what we noticed from the legislative work, and from the lawsuit work, it's like we were, going to the legislature, and a lot of the things that were holding us back when it came to, fiscal notes, budgets, how things were spent when it came to our taxpayer money, and trying to get these abolitionist legislation done. What we're noticing is we kept hearing from legislators from rural parts of our state, for example, our constituents don't want this. Our constituents don't want this. But being able to go out into the different places, through other work around, different parts of the criminalization of poverty, like bail, like privatized probation, like electronic monitoring, all of the parts of the system that make it different, whether you're poor or whether you have money or not. Right? And what we're starting to notice is we're hearing, oh, they don't want this, they don't want this. And we're going to places and seeing extreme poverty. We're seeing, hospitals get closed down. And it's like, okay, y'all, the conditions are what connect us. We're underdeveloped communities, whether we're talking about the Black community, whether we're talking about communities across rural, whether we're talking about the immigrant community, whatever community that we're talking about. What we're saying, the thing is, we're underdeveloped groups, and what we're using to address the underdevelopment is out of sight, out of mind. We're just gonna throw people away, and we're not seeing any investment in it. So what I think connects us, what goes across political spectrum and brings people closer in, is let's just focus in on the conditions, the material conditions, because I feel deep down, people are not going to work against their own self-interest as a collective if we put aside all of these labels and everything and just focus on the conditions.
Thank you, Dawn. I feel like that piece is really critical, because it is essentially the conditions too, right, that I think are generative in other kinds of organizing as well, right? We're seeing that labor movements, for example, are moving beyond just workplace issues, and they're dealing with a lot of conditions that students are experiencing. And that's the piece that's resonating, right? And we have to be really smart and strategic about the kind of organizing we do, both because, there's the fact that not everybody shares our politics, but also the fact that these organizing campaigns that we are involved in are opportunities for us, right? They're opportunities to kind of push our politics, yes, but it's a way for us to really engage in material issues that folks are experiencing in communities across the United States, right? My cat's joining us, so I apologize. And with that, I wanted to kind of address or share one of the questions that we had from the audience. So this is kind of going to go back to some of the defund work. And so I want to open up this question. I don't know if Bettina, Cheryl, or Rosa wants to answer. Someone asked us, how can we keep folks involved in defund the police movement? We had so many folks involved during the uprisings, but how can we keep that many folks always involved in our movement? And so I'm not sure who wants to answer.
I have something to say. Rosa, Bettina, I don't want to step on toes. I'll make it quick. Yeah, I think inevitably, let's be honest with ourselves, that obviously there are moments and times that motivate people to come out, and then that moment passes and there are a lot of people who will end up dropping off. However, I think one of the things we can really do to keep people engaged is to really invest in an abolitionist orientation towards the way that we deal with people. And by that, I have understood for me, have come to understand, had to learn this about what do I mean like to have an abolitionist orientation towards people, was not simply a non-carceral orientation towards people. Sometimes I think that's like where it stops, like non-carceral. But not just that. I really believe in Ruth Wilson Gilmore's like change everything sort of ethos about abolition. So to be like this abolitionist orientation towards people, I had to really change my understanding of the relationship that I was having towards people. And the relationship, I think Dawn spoke to this, people's materials condition, to really take care of each other. How do I keep that investment in the work that we're doing together is to really invest in that abolitionist orientation, which means to not think of people as disposable, to not think of people as just people I can just like, I need something from you and that's the end of our relationship. But to really instead think of like, how do we take care of each other? How do we invest in that commitment to each other? How do we invest in that commitment to resolving our problems outside of a system that just uses violence against us, that disposes us? And that will mean that you really need to start moving differently, because this is not the world that we are brought up in. That's not the system, that we live within. So yeah, really building community. And I don't mean this in just like a really trite, like you got to have community way, but really ask people, what do they need? What is going on? You don't just go out there and make a campaign that the campaign is like, I've decided this is what we need to do. You need to figure out, what do people need around you? What do you need to meet that, and to work together to meet those needs? I think you can also find those people who are always going to be invested in that liberation, because that boot is always on them. So this is, people of color, Black people in particular, like these communities that are really always seeing, and it's not just the George Floyd moment. That moment was the moment where, yes, the world sees, Rodney King moment. There's always these moments where then suddenly it seems that, oh, everyone is seeing what truly some communities are seeing all the time. If you're a community who is constantly being visited by police violence, if your community is constantly being visited, like immigration, ICE is at your door over every day, you are going to be someone who may be more invested and always getting in on that fight. So those are the people we need to make community with, bring into this fight, because those are the people who are constantly feeling the effects that some of us are only see sometimes as the result of like who is and is not the subject of capital's particular violence structurally. So yeah, I think that it requires just a different orientation around work. You do not create these campaigns, defund, otherwise, any abolitionist campaign to like make the goal and then like tell people what it should be. This is something that you really have to work collectively together with. Ask people, what is the thing that you need in this particular community? The particularities of these communities are important. Who you're working with is important. So dig deep there. And that's long-term work. That's investment work. But that's the work that we have to do. It's discouraging that some people, it's like a flash in the pan for them. And maybe that is. Maybe they'll also change. They'll see the tides and stuff. I wouldn't be discouraged, but I would just say, like, dig deep, make the community ask, what do people need? Talk to the people who are at the particular sort of end of this sort of violence, and build from there. And just build from there. Just keep going.
Yeah, I mean, Cheryl, I think this gets at kind of one of the challenges, right? And we've seen this in the chapter survey responses as well, which is abolition can't just be about responding to crisis as they come, right? Like, we have to understand we're in a perpetual state of crisis. That's what capitalism is. That's what it does, right? And so we have to think more strategically and long term about the kinds of campaigns that we're invested in, right? The kind of organizing that we do, because it can't just be that, like, a moment happens, we show up and we go home. And so if I think, like, one of the way I would respond to that is, like, how do we get more folks involved who, maybe show up in a crisis moment, and how do we, like, how do we shift them into long-term organizing? I think we do that by being deliberate about the types of campaigns that we organize. So yes, respond to a crisis, but go beyond it, right? And I think that that's one of the kind of struggles I think that happened at the chapter level, is so much of the organizing was really responsive to that moment, right? And then the moment passes, and then what? And so Bettina, Rosa, and Dawn, I don't know if you have something you want to say in response to that. All right, Bettina, go ahead.
Yeah, and just to build on that point, Danielle, there are super specific like things that are going on in your local communities that, like, if more folks were showing up, like if it's to eviction court, if it, you know what I'm saying, if y'all are just doing court watch, if y'all are observing that there are police like in your local schools and local universities, like what would it mean and what would it look like to organize student, like high school students and college students together to get cops out of their schools? And that, you know what I'm saying? So there are just specific ways that you can pivot defunding the police that has the goal in mind of not just refund, but defunding the police so that there's less contact, right? So when you think about contact with police and policing, I think that can help broaden and open the possibilities and like, yeah, the possibilities of where you all could figure out how your campaigns can pivot and what like specific demands y'all could figure out. And then someone else, like a couple of questions got brought up around DAs. So I was around in Chicago when a table, like a group of folks were running the Buy Anita campaign. And so one of the things that stuck out for me there was because I had never worked on an electoral campaign, and that was pure negative. Like all our campaign was about was removing Anita Alvarez, who is the Cook County State's Attorney for the city of Chicago. And we made that case by saying all the nasty shit that she did, right? So we just informed the public on what it is that a state's attorney does, and then inform the public that, hey, you all can actually elect your state's attorneys and your judges and your sheriffs. And this is our opportunity right now to remove this person that is so harmful to young Black and brown people and survivors in the city of Chicago. So like, that's a way of running an electoral campaign, right? That's like purely negative, but also like our campaign wasn't about electing someone else. And in my opinion, as abolitionists, we don't necessarily need to always have the alternative or the solution. The point is that the way things are nightmarish and barely imaginable. Like, jails and prisons are built to disappear people from our communities, and they're also built to like obscure, right? Like what actually happens there. So when folks are asking me, you know, what is my imagination, or like how do I imagine, or what do I like what is a blueprint, right, for abolition? I refuse that question, because it's like, I feel that if we close our eyes and imagine what safety means and has looked like for us, it is never a cop, and it's definitely not a jail and not a prison. So actually, it's pretty easy to imagine what abolition looks like for our communities, because when we like think of who keeps us safe, it's usually like the grandma that lived on the block, right? That would like keep, that would watch us. It would be the lady on the block that would always give us, the, you know, give out the candy, and like was able to diffuse like fights that might be happening. Like folks that are like watching us, but not to police us, but out of love and like care and wanting to, you know, keep us together. And so that to me is different from community policing and all that, right? So anyway, all to say, I don't think that we as abolitionists need to come out with blueprints and like this fully formed idea of what abolition looks like for us. Our job is to name that these institutions are violent and hurting us and harming us right now, and it is intolerable. And to make it intolerable for the people that think that that's okay, for our young people, for survivors, for women to just be disappeared or harmed, right? Like, so anyway, I'm getting off track. That's all to say, I don't think that you can run a class struggle campaign around prosecutors. I'm just saying, that's me. Like, I'm not speaking for the whole working group, but that's just me. So in my opinion, I don't think that socialists should be wasting our time on prosecutors. I understand that it's like a harm reduction tactic. But the harm reduction tactic, in my opinion, is letting people know what prosecutors actually do and that they can be replaced. And always reminding those prosecutors that they can be replaced, and building up that, building up that energy, and the energy to like just remove people so that they're afraid and know that we're watching them, and making sure that, that's the form of accountability, not just electing folks, right? So that's my opinion on DAs and everything. I know that we're at time, so I'm gonna shut up. But if you all wanna like hit us up, I love talking shop. So if you guys have specific campaigns and all that, totally hit us up on the working group email. We're planning on doing like hangouts where we can talk about what's been working and what's not been working in our campaigns. So I would love to see you all there. Thanks.
Thank you, Bettina, for that. I think, as Elizabeth was saying, you're getting lots of reactions in the chat that we can't see. So, but I think that that's a good point to kind of end with, which is to say, like, we have to be really clear, right, in terms of how we engage with abolitionist organizing, about what we go after and what we don't. Right. We're not in a position yet where we can just do everything. We can't. And it doesn't even make sense to. Right. There's a point at which, as Bettina pointed out, that these DA races may be political education opportunities, but we're not going to build power by organizing around them. Right. Like, those are two very different things. And we have to be really focused on how do we actually build power? What are the campaigns that are going to shift people's material conditions now and build towards abolition in the future, right? Because we have to take seriously what people need now, right? Their safety, their ability to survive, and more than survive, right? We need to get our communities back, right? And stop settling for so little under capitalism. And so I just want to thank Rosa, Cheryl, Dawn, and Bettina for being on this panel. I want to thank all of you for attending, and please look out for things from the Abolition Working Group. We're going to hopefully host a Defund Summit in the fall to get all the chapters together on Zoom in order to share their experiences and hopefully build together and become more effective in this work. And we look forward, just in general, to getting to know everybody in the chapters and to building out abolitionist organizing in DSA. So thank you very much, and have a good evening.